Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a returning guest, John E. Lewis, PhD. He's the founder and president of Dr. Lewis Nutrition. Last time we spoke, we didn't cover a study that they had participated in on multiple sclerosis and how it interfaces with the other conditions they work with, such as Alzheimer's, and the presence or absence of polysaccharides modulating these conditions. So we're going to focus more on multiple sclerosis today and possibly some other conditions. John, he's a past associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. He's been a principal investigator for over 30 different studies in his research career. He's looked at the effects of nutrition, dietary supplementation, and exercise on human health. And he's put out over 180 peer-reviewed publications in some top journals, which is quite a bit. So welcome back, John.
Thank you, Richard, for having me back. It's great to speak with you. I appreciate the opportunity.
No problem. Let's dive right in. So tell me about the work that you've been doing in multiple sclerosis. What have you been working on?
Well, we ran, as we discussed in our previous conversation, we ran clinical trials, as you mentioned, in Alzheimer's disease, and we also ran another clinical trial in people with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. Now, as any of our listeners would probably know, especially if they've had either the condition themselves or maybe a family member they cared for or helped out or someone in their circle, it's typically not considered as devastating of a disease as Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, but certainly it falls within that realm of neurodegeneration, although a lot of people would say that it's not purely neurodegeneration, right? Like it's kind of a hybrid of neurodegeneration with autoimmunity. But we ran a clinical trial in a group of folks with relapsing remitting MS. We use not exactly the same formulation in the Alzheimer's study, but it was a similar allopolysaccharide-based formulation that both of those studies obviously led to the creation of daily brain care that we use now. But we had, again, from the perspective of, well, what is it that is most significant to people with MS? And actually, I could argue that it's not the neurodegeneration aspect of it. And for those of you who don't know, and I didn't know this myself until getting into the study, people with MS don't actually die from the neurodegeneration as far as the averages go. The average leading cause of mortality in people with MS is, guess what? Infection, which is fascinating to me. So again, it kind of melds this combination of having the neurodegeneration along with the autoimmunity. So people get, something common, a lung infection, a UTI, any other kind of infection in the body. And then that ends up being the leading cause of mortality in people with MS. So what we found in our study is that from baseline, they had on average, which is just mind-boggling, it was just under 8. It was 7.9 infections. And then at 12 months, it was the exact same structure as the Alzheimer's study. It was a 12-month intervention and then looking at outcomes over the quarter of that 12-month period. And at 12 months, they were all the way down to 2.5 infections. So just a really staggering drop in the number of infections. So not only are you...
what caused this reduction?
So the polysaccharide, again, we're circling this all back to the argument of using polysaccharide polysaccharides for a number of reasons. And now in this case, it's their anti-infectious capacity. So not just from our lab, but other labs around the world have shown that the polysaccharides, both from aloe vera and rice bran, have incredible antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal effect, and to be able to keep people alive. And then also, again, as you can imagine, you've got MS already, so it's a very complicated, costly treatment process. Now you get an infection. Now you go to an urgent care center or a hospital or whatever, and maybe you stay in there for a while. Now you have all that extra cost added on top of your regular treatment. So keeping people out of an already overburdened from a financial perspective and even I would say a personnel perspective is just an incredible benefit and something that we had no idea, would happen in our study. I mean, we were like we were in the Alzheimer's study, again, hopeful and optimistic based on everything Dr. McDaniel, my colleague and mentor, who I probably mentioned in our first conversation, who got me into all this. And so to see that type of reduction in infections was just huge for us. I mean, just probably the most exciting aspect of this study. Now, unfortunately, we didn't collect infections in the Alzheimer's study. It would have been interesting had we looked at that as well. But in this study, that was just a really impressive finding. In addition, we showed very nice improvement in the immune function and in the inflammation biomarkers as well. So the two key ones, in my opinion, and again, for anybody who's interested in reading our papers, we published 3 papers from the MS study, 4 papers from the Alzheimer's study. But the 2 key biomarker findings, in my opinion, were, first of all, EGF, epidermal growth factor. Now, that's a very interesting protein. It's looked at for its inflammatory aspect, but it's also looked at as a very key component. It's a protein that actually is needed for remyelination of central nervous system tissue. So what does that mean? Well, again, for anybody who either is listening who has had MS or knows people who has had MS, demyelination of the central nervous system of the myelin sheath, that's a big contributing factor to what MS actually is and the pathology of it, right? Like you progressively lose that myelin sheath in your nervous system, in your central nervous system. And this is why you ultimately have all of this loss of movement, of functionality. So theoretically, over time, you could end up basically being almost like paralyzed. And so EGF is a very important protein in remyelinating the central nervous system, meaning to help that myelin sheath actually grow back again. So that was a really nice finding that we showed an increase in EGF over the 12-month period. And then we found that a gene called FAS, the FAST gene, and it's kind of the genetic characteristic, if you will, of overall immune system functioning. So the CD34, CD95 cells encode in that gene, and that's a very important characteristic of looking at overall immune system functioning. So for those of you who may have heard us speak the first time, and you remember that we looked at the CD4 to CD8 ratio in the Alzheimer's folk, and that increased over time. So that helper cell to cytotoxic cell ratio is a very important characteristic or overall marker of immune system functioning. One of the genetic ways you can look at overall immune system functioning is how the FAS gene responds to, again, different stimuli, in this case, our dietary supplement. So we showed a nice increase there. So those were what we felt like were 2 very impressive biomarkers that improved dramatically in the 12-month intervention that then correlate with all of the physical functioning, mood, height, characteristics, all the different symptomatologies. Again, we know that some people with MS definitely have cognitive deficits. It's nowhere near as significant as people with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, but certainly they have cognitive deficits that can be problematic, but much more so they have issues with physical functioning. So their ability, to even get to the toilet, get in and out of bed, get to the kitchen to get something to eat or drink. I mean, these are all very significant issues for people with MS. They just don't have the strength or the functional capacity. So there's a measure called the Functional Assessment of MS, the FANS, FAMS. And much like in the Alzheimer's study, we use the ADAS-Cog as the gold standard for assessing cognitive function, particularly in people with dementia. So the FAMS is the gold standard for assessing physical functioning in people with MS. And again, Richard, across the board, I think there were 7 scales on that measure, including the overall scale, and only like 2 of them, one was almost statistically significant, one was not, but all the others were wildly statistically significant improvement across that 12-month period. So again, those were really impressive findings linking what's happening at the cellular level. Why would you expect all these improvements at the clinical level, like according to the fans? Well, you can see them when you have improved immune functioning, along with improving the remyelination aspect of what's going on at the central nervous system. So,
well, how do you that is remyelination happen?
Well, again, it's a big part of being given the raw materials that the cells need to function correctly, right? I mean, like, I think as we discussed in our first conversation, oxygen is our first nutrient, right? We can't survive too long without oxygen. Although, actually, as a side note, I just saw some guy that set the world record for holding his breath for 29 minutes underwater. I don't know how the heck he did that. But, I mean, for, all the rest of us that are not genetically capable of doing that, we can't survive without oxygen very long. Water being our second nutrient. And then we need amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, other elements. There's about 40 different, Dr. Bruce Ames has identified about 40 different essential, let's call them dietary compounds that we need for our cells to function properly. He did not include the polysaccharides from aloe vera and rice bran. That's not, I don't know even if he knows anything about this, but that's not something that, commonly, that's why I'm talking to folks like yourself to help spread this message of how crucial these nutrients are. But when you put all of these things together, it allows the body's own inherent intelligence to be able to guide its own healing process, right? And we're not talking about treating the symptoms of a disease or, treating disease itself with a pharmacological synthetic chemical. We're talking about utilizing the nutrients that the body uses, that the genes recognize, interpret the information from all those different compounds, and then instructing the cells in how to function properly. So again, EGF has been determined to be one of these very important proteins to be able to create the myelin sheath. I mean, it's just like one of those, it's like cholesterol, right? I mean, cholesterol is in every single cell in our body. We need cholesterol. Otherwise, our cells can't function properly, just like we need vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, all the different Bs, calcium, magnesium. I mean, we need all these different elements, vitamins, minerals to be able to function properly. So what seemed to occur in our study was that, again, providing the subjects with these polysaccharides, that it somehow, again, through the body's own inherent intelligence, and I can't really explain it any better than that, but it takes the information from those polysaccharides and it turns on these, let's call them tissue building properties, if you will, for lack of a better term. And again, what we showed in this particular protein and turning on this EGF, raising its production quite dramatically, that's very important for people with MS.
So what makes someone either do better or not do better and, when they have MS? It seems like the condition kind of goes quiet for a while and then comes back out and flares up. Has anyone identified what prods it into being more active or less active at different times?
That's a very good question. I'm thinking of one of the people who actually takes daily brain care, who has had MS. I believe she told me when I met her 2 years ago, for over 35 years. So you can imagine how much difficulty this lady has had in her life. But she was very much a fan of looking into environmental exposure. So whether it's heavy metal issues, PCBs, unfortunately, I don't know if there's any place in the world today that we can live and escape all the pollution in the environment. But she was very much into, this aspect of exposure and how much of a toxic load you're carrying around. So one of the things that daily brain care can actually help people do from a number of different perspectives, not just from the polysaccharides, but when you look at a few of the other ingredients in it, first of all, primarily the ultra-terra clay. So it's like a bentonite clay that comes from this very old lake in Mississippi. And this clay has a capacity to strip out cations, right? Positively charged things that are typically bad for us. So most of those would usually be one of the heavy metals, whether it's mercury or lead or aluminum. But then, of course, you had other things like arsenic and, again, these PCBs and all these other chemicals that we've inputted into really since the industrial age, all these different, mostly things that are made from plastics or petroleum. So you have all this stuff that floats around. It gets in our water, our soil, or air. and then we somehow consume it, whether we eat something or drink something or even just breathing it, and then it stores in our fat tissue, right? Well, the clay, and we know humans have been using clay for many, many years, if not millennia, to help detoxify the body from a lot of these materials. So that's one of the things that we have in our formula that help to get rid of that toxic load. But I guess, again, when you look at it from a planetary level, again, there's nowhere we can go, right? I mean, we can't live in a bubble, and eventually we're going to breathe something or consume something some way. So I would imagine it's kind of like if you could do some sort of real-time analysis of your toxic load, depending on, how much time you spend in certain areas compared to others. It would be fascinating to look at if you had some sort of real-time analysis of how much mercury you're taking on, or arsenic, or some of these other things in their environment that are just so almost ubiquitous today, that probably some of that, at least according to what, this lady's theory was to some degree, is if you're taking on these, toxic loads at different times, then I would imagine that drives your symptomatology, right? Like you may go somewhere where it's not so polluted and you spend some time there for a while, and then you start feeling better because the body detoxes or gets rid of some of that material. But then you go back to your typical, living space. If you're living in a city like we do, then obviously you're breathing air that's more contaminated out compared to somebody who lives out in the country. But that would be, I'm kind of theorizing here, but to answer your question, that would be probably my best guess of how symptoms come and go. It's really related to some degree to your toxic load and how much you're carrying, and then whether or not you're feeding the body with the materials that will help you or help it to detoxify itself. And then doing that, of course, on a regular basis, I would assume would be very important. And of course, you'd probably, even without having real-time data, certainly you could do, I remember one of my old functional medicine friends from 25 years ago, he thought doing a hair analysis for heavy metal exposure was pretty accurate. He was not a big fan of the blood. He didn't feel like looking in the blood was very effective. And then the only way you would do it in the urine is if you did he used to use either DMSO or DMPS. He would use what he called a push challenge test, where he would measure pre and post the urine after you did a DMSO or DMPS push. But he was a big fan of taking just a little nape, like on the nape of your neck, just taking a little bit of your hair from there. And then I forget the lab. It was actually somewhere in Arizona, I think. And then that's 25 years ago. I'd have to go back and check my records. But I know for a lot of his patients, he would look at heavy metal exposure in the hair. And then he was big into chelation back in those days of, helping to cleanse and detoxify that stuff. But being a little bit long-winded to answer your question, to sum it up, I do think a big part of it is environmental exposure, and then being able to handle that, with a good detoxification strategy, I think would probably help dictate whether or not somebody is very symptomatic all the way to totally asymptomatic.
Okay. What about Alzheimer's? Any protocols you've discovered that, help reduce symptoms or, make the person more functional?
Well, going back to our initial conversation, that was the formula that I probably mentioned to you in that conversation. And I would say that, the MS study is part of that crowning achievement, but of my entire academic career, without question, anything that came out of my lab, I'm the most proud of would be the first paper that we published from our Alzheimer's study. And I just, even still today, it's mind-boggling because that first paper was published in 2013, which is hard to believe it's been 12 years ago, but we showed clinically and statistically improvement in cognitive function at 9 and 12 months intervention on our formula, on our dietary supplement formula, that, Richard, again, is unheard of. There's nothing else out there, even 13 years later. And the only, real regret for me of leaving academics full time is that I could not get any funding. And it was only due to the generosity of this one family that had heard Dr. McDaniel give a lecture, and he thought he was doing something that was very worthwhile with people with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And so she and her husband ultimately made a donation to research that I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Dr. McDaniel was not affiliated with the university or any research institution. And so he turned to me, he said, "John, we've got an opportunity to run a study here. It just has to be done in Alzheimer's." And of course, in South Florida, we have a lot of elderly people, and unfortunately, a lot of elderly people with Alzheimer's. And so we ran the study, and we looked at people with moderate to severe severity, which is the sickest group of people. It's not mild cognitive impairment or even mild dementia. Those are the folks that are really sick and really impaired. They were 79.9 years of age on average. They also didn't just have Alzheimer's. They had diabetes, depression, different forms of heart disease. I don't remember too much cancer. There might have been a patient or two that had cancer, but these were just really sick and pretty old folks. And again, to show clinically and statistically significant improvement in cognitive function according to the ADAS-Cog, which is the gold standard for assessing cognitive function in people with dementia, it just blew us away. I mean, even the psychiatrist, the clinic psychiatrist, who was the person responsible for making the diagnosis, even he couldn't believe it. He was very skeptical when we first started running the study. He was like, well, I don't really use nutrition in my practice, and I'm pretty much all into the drug paradigm, which unfortunately most psychiatrists are. And even he had to admit, as big of a skeptic as he was when we first started running the trial, even he had to admit, if he hadn't been seeing these patients himself, he wouldn't have believed it. But he had to give credit to the polysaccharide formula that people were responding to and were making dramatic changes. But we also showed, as I mentioned in that previous comment about the immune function, we also showed that CD4 to CD8 ratio increase. We showed decreases in TNF alpha and VEGF, that vascular endothelial growth factor. And those are two inflammatory markers, two proteins that are commonly looked at in heart disease and cancer. And our paper was probably the first paper that showed that kind of a change in people with Alzheimer's disease. And then finally, we showed an improvement in CD14 cells, which are a marker of adult stem cells. We know through other research that CD14s can turn into neurons, but we showed an increase in those cells of just under 300%. So imagine, somebody who's 80 years of age, you had Alzheimer's disease at least for 1 year, you're at a very severe severity level, and you're ramping up your adult stem cell production. I mean, it's like you're going back to your 20s again or 30s in terms of that part of the body machinery. And so those physiological changes for us were very significant and important in being able to explain, well, why in the world did these people start thinking again? Why in the world? I mean, I had caregivers as we were running the study, as the study was ongoing, I had caregivers calling me in tears. I mean, they couldn't believe their loved one in some cases was talking about, anniversaries or people or events or just other things that in some cases they hadn't talked about in years. I mean, you can imagine how emotionally overwhelming it is. In fact, I'm getting chill bump every time I tell the story. It gives me chill bump because for me, it just, to be able to make such a difference in someone's life is truly phenomenal. And as a scientist, I mean, again, it's wonderful to be an ethical scientist, spend your money properly, your budget, keep your budget intact, do your work the way you're supposed to. But imagine, Richard, a lot of those folks, they do a great job in their career and their work never really sees the light of day, right? I mean, they maybe are only working on cells or tissues or animals, and it never translates to actually helping people. What we were doing, my colleagues and I mean, we could see the benefit immediately. There wasn't any, this was in hamster. Does it work for humans? No, we knew immediately whether this stuff worked. And so that level of satisfaction and being able to help people was probably, besides the results themselves, the idea that what we were doing was actually helping people and making a difference in people's lives was truly the most rewarding aspect of my research. And again, for your listeners who know you've had somebody in your family or someone close to you with Alzheimer's, you know how tragic this disease is, right? It's the 6th leading killer of Americans. The 5 FDA-approved drugs for dementia basically do nothing. If you're lucky, you have a delay in the progression of the disease for maybe a year or two, if you're lucky, but then the person continues falling off the cliff. And then as tragic as that, the primary caregiver of someone with Alzheimer's has the worst health outcomes of any other type of caregiver, whether it's for someone with cancer or heart disease or HIV or something like that. The people who are caring for their family member, in most cases of somebody with Alzheimer's, they also are dying from this disease. It's an indirect death, but they're getting killed by caring for the person with Alzheimer's disease. So it's not just the one individual. In many cases, it's a dyad of two people that are going down the tube because of this horrible disease. And nobody can even come up. I mean, forget a treatment. Nobody can even, I say nobody, the scientific community can't even come up with a consensus of what causes it. It's like you talk to a neurologist or a psychiatrist or a functional medicine physician, somebody that focused on dementia or brain health, and they'll tell you like every patient that they see with that disease, it's like an N of one, it's like a population of one because it's so unique to each individual. You can't can't even wrap your mind or, wrap your arms around, well, what the etiology here. There is none. So it's like, it truly is a mystery. I mean, it is the mystery disease. Cancer, with all of its strange anomalies and all of its differences, doesn't even compare to dementia and Alzheimer's, because the other fascinating feature about what happens to the brain is, you have this clinical diagnosis, right? You have a psychiatrist or a neurologist, somebody who goes through a process to diagnose somebody with Alzheimer's disease based on all these clinical features. Well, there's something like 30% of the people who end up dying and they were diagnosed from Alzheimer's. And then if you do a postmortem autopsy on the brain, they didn't even have tau or plaque or tangles or anything in the brain. So there's this group of people who clinically meet the diagnosis, but they don't have the morphology in the brain. Then there's another group of people who have the morphology in the brain, but they never died of Alzheimer's. And then you have that other group, I guess you could say the typical group, that had the clinical features and had the brain morphology changes. So even along those lines, there's no consensus. It's just a bizarre disease. But the bottom line is using something like daily brain care, again, without sounding arrogant or egotistical about it, I don't know of anything else that's better than what we have that can help people. That's the bottom line to me, is regardless of whatever the scientific community thinks about what causes it, or all these medical interventions to do something that unfortunately do not do squat, we have a product that actually can help you.
When people take the product, what do they notice maybe in the first week or two? And then what do they notice as they've been consistently taking it?
This is a great question. So one of the main things that people notice, and of course, this depends on a little bit of trial and error, right? Like, it depends on if you're taking the correct amount. But one of the quickest things that people will notice is better sleep. So we got, I don't know, I read a statistic that almost seems unbelievable. Something like half of America have, if they don't have outright insomnia, they have at least some sort of, they call it difficulty in sleeping. And so imagine what that's doing to your brain. Forget the fact that you wake up the next day and you don't feel well, but you're not sleeping through the night. So then your brain is not able, along with the rest of your body, to clear out all the metabolic waste that builds up. And that is considered to be a leading factor predisposing people to having dementia later in life. But definitely people report better sleep. They report better focus. They report more energy. A lot of people will actually have better gut function, like it helps rapidly to start putting the microbiome in a balance where people have too much dysbiosis, and then it helps to start correcting that. Pretty swiftly as this.
How do they affect the microbiome from your observation?
Science, Joe. So another cool aspect of these polysaccharides is that they have sort of like a prebiotic effect. So if you look at, there are oligosaccharides, and the most common ones would be in like breast milk of any mammal. And of course, that's obviously very important for the infant nursing its mother. But these polysaccharides tend to help shift the gut in a way that helps better overall gut function. And I'm not a GI specialty, is not really, my area, but there was a really nice article that was published, I think it was in 23, that went through a long explanation of how these polysaccharides basically function like prebiotic fiber in a way. So they just help to regulate the gut function overall. But I had one of, I'll always think of this one particular customer, this lady, not too old, like in her 30s, but had IBS constipation for years. This lady had tried everything to correct her GI functioning. And in fact, at the point that I met her, she was getting ready to spend $2,000. She had found this new functional medicine group or physician. I don't remember the practice, but she had found somebody or some group of somebodies who was going to charge her a $2,000 workup to try to get to the root of her GI issue to help her poop properly. And I said, well, just give daily brain care a try. We've had lots of people over the years say they have better bowel movements when they take this product. I kid you not, in less than, I don't even think it was 5 days, she called me up and she goes, John, I can't believe it. I'm pooping like a champ already. I canceled that appointment. I'm saving that $2,000. So, in that case, you're talking about a pretty rapid response. And she hadn't, to my knowledge, I'd have to ask her to double check, but I don't think she did anything dramatically different with her diet. Her diet was still pretty much the same as she was always eating. He just couldn't, for the life of her, she couldn't figure out how to just have like a normal bowel movement without having all the constipation. So that was like in less than a week, she noticed this big GI change. And so I tell people, like, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, on any drug, especially if you go to the PDR, the physician's death reference for all the different drugs that are legally sold, every drug has what is referred to as a black box warning, right? And that's basically the list of the adverse side effects. And we like to refer, I say we, Dr. McDaniel, we like to refer to the polysaccharides of having a white box effect. What does that mean? That means that we have seen so many, let's call them unexpected good effects or unexpected changes in people over now these, combined decades of years of experience between us, that we don't even like to bias people in terms of saying, well, hey, you may think this or you may see that or, whatever. Like it just, every person is so unique, and every sort of, the system, this machine that we each are, everyone has its own potential to have different effects. But again, commonly you're talking about improvements in sleep, improvements in energy level, improvements in focus and clarity, improvements in GI function. People even start responding in terms of having like they notice their skin is better, their nails I cut my nails like twice a week, and I've been on this formula for over a decade now. I have to cut my nails like a couple of times a week. My hair grows really fast. I get a haircut every month. So there can be all sorts of changes that somebody potentially may have. I've even got one customer now. She told me that anytime she gets a headache, she takes daily brain care normally anyway. Like, I don't know what her daily dose is, but if she says she gets a headache just from, work, or maybe she's not feeling well or something, she'll take an extra dose of daily brain care, and within a few minutes, her headache goes away, almost like a Tylenol effect, which I thought were phenomenal. So there are just literally an almost unlimited number of responses that we expect people to have once they start taking it. And again, going back to my earlier comment, if someone feels nothing, and that, of course, unfortunately will happen occasionally, then I tell people that either, number one, you're not taking a big enough dose, or number two, you're not being patient enough to allow the body to work, because sometimes there are definitely people out there who respond slower than others. So it just, sometimes those folks have to be a little more patient.
So typically, just a few days after taking the polysaccharides, people notice significant changes.
In some cases, I refer to these people as super responders. So these are people that have, for whatever capacity reason, however they're able to do it, literally within a week, they will start noticing changes. That's probably 25, maybe as much as 30% of the people. The majority of people, roughly, half of us, half of the world, they're going to need somewhere between 30 and 60, maybe even up to 90 days to notice an effect. And then based on our research, there were some people in the study that took over 90, I'm referring to the Alzheimer's study, that took over 90 days to start showing benefit. So, and that's probably another 20% or so of those. But I do think that those slow responders are probably, not only are they slower responders, but they also probably need, for whatever reason, a bigger dose. That could be due to just more impairment, more severity of impairment. Maybe they have had other environmental exposures, that have contributed to them being in the state they're in, so they need more support. I don't want to dismiss entirely the role of genetics, although, some people, they think you have genetic predispositions and therefore there's nothing you can do about them. I don't fall in that camp unless it's, something truly genetic, like, Marfan syndrome or Down syndrome or something like that. Those are clearly genetic anomalies. But, again, I would imagine, and we could potentially show this if we had more funding for research, that if we were able to dose different people with different conditions and then look at those different doses, we could probably dial in a little bit better how quickly someone responds. But we just, I haven't been in academics now full time for 8 years. And so I don't currently have the funding to be able to run some of these other studies. People are constantly asking me all the time about, well, what about this or what about that? And I'm like, well, we have individuals that I can point to in some cases, but in terms of answering conclusively in a clinical trial for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, depression, a lot of these other things that ultimately kill people, we don't have those answers from clinical trials. The best we can do at this point is with anecdotal responses.
Well, so how can people get hold of the polysaccharides? Where can they go to contact you and to try this out?
drlewisnutrition.com is our main website. Our flagship formula that's based on this research we've been discussing today is Daily Brain Care. And we can also be found on all the typical social media channels under the Dr. Lewis Nutrition handle as well. We have, again, all of this research that we publish that I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested. You can go to our website and email us. We can share those articles with you if the information on the website is not already enough. But I really appreciate your time today and the opportunity again to talk about our research and our mission to help people. I mean, we're ultimately would love to touch 1 million lives or more over, our company's life cycle. I'm hoping way more than that, but it's hard to be too optimistic without knowing how the future unfolds. But again, it's great to be with you again, Richard, and thank you for the opportunity for the time today.
Yeah, no problem. And, definitely recommend people check it out, and they'll know pretty quickly if it helps them or not. So, yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming back. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, hold on a second.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.